Ali imaš mišljenje. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this evening. It's an exceptional pleasure to have you here at the Harvard Club. Special thanks goes to a good friend of mine, Sana Sabah. I can't see her in the audience. Well, she's there. She's in a way our host this evening. So thank you, Sana, for hosting us and for making this possible. And I'm so happy to see here a great number of former colleagues whom I had a privilege to work with during the year when I served as a president of the UN General Assembly. Well, right after I finished with my term, I came to Belgrade, some of you do know, and I set up a Foreign Policy Institute, a think tank, a Center for International Relations and Sustainable Development with a great help of my friends and some former colleagues. So our board is comprised of a number of renowned international figures, former or current heads of state and government and cabinet ministers and leading academics. And some of them are with us tonight. Jeffrey Sachs, my old teacher and professor, who was serving on a board of the CIRSD. Our mission is to provide a high-quality, independent analysis, we hope, with the aim of strengthening peaceful cooperation between states and increasing responsiveness to changing global circumstances, encouraging a more inclusive and equitable international system, and advocating sustainable development as the cornerstone of the UN post-2015 agenda. We've only been in existence for about a year now, but we did manage to put together a number of interesting events and conferences. In Belgrade, we had a conference on the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of the First World War, also a conference on climate change and the green economy with some leading authorities in the field. We also organized a big conference on the Silk Road, on the New Silk Road initiative, together with the Turkish and Chinese government in Istanbul. We organized a big energy security conference in China and a sustainable development in the Mediterranean conference in Morocco in this last year. We're also very proud to be able to say that we've published in Serbian a number of books from prominent authors, starting with the new book of Jeff Sachs, Age of Sustainable Development, that had its premiere in Belgrade in Serbian in November. And by the way, I want to invite you to go for the premiere of the American version, which is in 2nd of March here in New York. But we were very pleased and privileged to put it out in Serbian first, and that was the world premiere for which Professor Sachs came to Belgrade. We also published, well, actually we are going to publish next month, the Serbian translation of Kishore Mahbubani's Great Convergence. So we're going to have it next month, and in a few months, Ian Bremmer, my good old friend Ian Bremmer's new book, Superpower. I'm going to leave you to guess which superpower he's talking about, is also going to be published in Serbian in the month of May. But today we're here to promote, in a way, a flagship product of the Center for International Relations and Sustainable Development, and that's a magazine, a quarterly English language journal, Horizons, Journal of International Relations and Sustainable Development, which is a new high-level platform for influential voices from around the world to provide informed analysis and conduct reasoned exchanges on pressing global issues. And our current issue is about West in Russia, a new Cold War with a question mark. And I hope we're going to tonight perhaps step closer to understanding or having an opinion on whether or not this is a new Cold War. But I'd like to point your attention to one thing, since we had this conference in Belgrade about the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of the First World War. And if I remember well, Jeff Sachs made a striking comparison between the world of 100 years ago and the world of today. And if I remember well, Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong, in 1914 there was a a best-selling book that was published in the United Kingdom by Norman Angell, a very renowned author of the time, who made a very strong and a very authoritative claim that because of the growing interdependence between the world's actors and vast leaps in technology, and he was obviously referring to telegraph and telephone, there is very, very little chance that the world is going to go through a world war in the 20th century. And that book came out in February of 1914 in London. Obviously, we all know what happened afterwards, but I'm going to fast forward 100 years down the road, and I'm going to point your attention to the Davos Global Risks Report of last year. And you'll know Davos, and you'll know that they're taking themselves very seriously about viewing the world and understanding the world. Well, the Davos Global Risks Report of last year did not contain the word Ukraine. So there are some similarities between the situations that we had in the world 100 years ago and the situation that we have now. And one of the crises definitely is the crisis of relations between Russia and the West. So we were very privileged to be able to feature a great number of truly prominent authors in this edition, and I hope you're all going to have your copy of Horizons. On its main theme, we had Sergei Lavrov writing, but also President Kwasniewski, Joseph Nye, Lamberto Zanier of OSCE. We had Karl Theodor zu Guttenberg, who wrote a piece together with James Stavridis, the former Supreme Allied Commander, now Dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. We had Wolfgang Ischinger, Dmitry Trenin, Thierry de Montbrial writing. We also had people from ASEAN writing about ASEAN, starting with the Foreign Minister of Singapore, Shanmugam, but also Kishore Mahbubani. We had also reviews and reflections of some books with a view of looking to the world from the wider perspective. And one good friend of mine, former colleague and now permanent representative of Brazil, Mr. Patriota, wrote a piece as well. We're very grateful for your piece. Thank you very much, Antonio. So we are here to discuss the main topic of Horizons Winter 2015 issue, the relations between Russia and the West. And without further ado, if you allow me, I would now join the participants and let them talk about this. And I'm sure they're much better informed and more and better spoken about this issue than I am. But thank you very much for joining us, and stay tuned. Now, from a totally different perspective, I'm going to start by saying that I'm exceptionally grateful to your kind accepting to join us this evening. With us, we have Karl Theodor zu Guttenberg, my old friend and former colleague. He's currently non-resident fellow at Harvard. He's currently the chairman and founder of Spitzberg Partners, and distinguished statesman at the CSIS. He previously served as German Minister of Defense and also Minister of Economics and Technology. And he was, prior to that, the Secretary General of the CSU party in Germany. We have Ambassador Vitaly Churkin. Since May 2006, he has served as the permanent representative of the Russian Federation to the United Nations. Previously, he was ambassador to Canada and Belgium, and also spokesman for the Russian Foreign Ministry, and at some point from 92 to 94, to be precise, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation. Then we have Jeff Sachs, my old professor from the days at Harvard, and he's no longer at Harvard.
Old so much.
I'm sorry I can't make this connection with Columbia, but I still like you very much, as you know. He's currently director of Earth Institute at Columbia University and director of UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. He's a special advisor to Secretary General Ban Ki-moon on MDGs, one of the world's leading developmental economists. Taught at Harvard at some point in his life, and rose to global fame when he helped turn around Poland's economy after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Last but not least, a dear friend, Kevin Rudd, who is currently at Harvard, but also he was recently appointed president of the Asian Society Policy Institute here in New York City.
Started 2 weeks ago.
Well, yes, so this is the freshest thing. Yes. But in your distant past, you were somewhat, in a way, involved in Australian politics. As a matter of fact, he served as the Prime Minister of Australia twice, but he also served as the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Australia, and that's the period when he and I met, and that's where our friendship started back in 2012. Now, without further ado, I'm going to dive into the topic of tonight's debate. And I'm going to start by KT, by Karl Theodor zu Guttenberg. My main takeaway from the Munich Security Conference, which happened a couple of weeks ago, in a way can be summarized or can be related to the reference to the title of the Horizons essay that you wrote together with Admiral Stavridis. And that was, who is to blame? How did we get to this crisis? Because this is obviously a very serious crisis. And if I recall well, your unequivocal answer that you gave in the article is that it's Russia who is to blame. Now, why do you think the responsibility for the Ukrainian crisis lies squarely with the Kremlin?
I did not give the answer that solely Russia is to blame. I pointed at the accusation that mainly the NATO and the West would be to blame for the development we have seen so far. There are certain points where I would harshly blame Russia for the developments we're in right now, but it's not that easy. There are, of course, also specific groups within the Ukraine that bear the burden of blame. There is a European Union which is still struggling to find a common security and foreign policy. There is an American administration where I somehow struggle to find a coherent message when it comes to that very issue. So there are many, many breakstones that need to be taken into account if you talk and discuss about that topic. Having said that, I think when we look at the current situation in Ukraine, to put it very mildly and diplomatically, the annexation of the Crimea, was not one of the most helpful steps to find an equilibrium for that very situation we face right now. The constant delivery of arms to the rebels does not solely help the situation. Breaking accords we have actually agreed upon, may it be directly or indirectly via the separatists, does also not help the situation. So the list could be prolonged in that very respect. And I don't take it for granted if someone tells me, well, the Crimea has been just the same situation like in Kosovo. No, it was a very different situation, historically and de facto. And all the surrounding facts were different as well. And it's not as easy to say, well, it was a referendum in the Crimea, which was a peaceful and normal referendum done by the people over there. Well, if you set up a referendum in 10 days' notice, if you send your troops before the referendum already to the Crimea, if you come up with solutions that are actually not tied to the constitutional situation in the Ukraine, it's not what I would call the best of all cases of how to conduct a referendum. So those are things which have been clearly, at least clearly influenced by the Kremlin and by Russia. And steps that could have been taken to tame the situation have not been played out well in that very regard, or have not been taken by the Russian administration. So all in all, I think the situation, of course, plays into the hands of those who would like to see the whole thing still bubbling the way it bubbles, but not into a peaceful solution we all seek to have from a European and global perspective.
Well, my role here is to moderate, so I need to be fully neutral, and therefore I'm not going to make any comments on Kosovo, because I'm not known for neutrality when it comes to the issue. but the thing
I
is,
actually expected it, but it's
but like, if you want, Katie, that's the current situation and that's the current crisis. But if one wants to talk about, roots, about the strategic source of the friction that we have right now, in your essay, you dismissed the argument that the end of the Cold War sowed the seeds of the Ukrainian crisis, and you call it a false narrative. And I'll quote, the Cold War did not just suddenly end, rather it was spectacularly lost by one side. And adding that the terms of the West victory were quite generous. Well, some people, though, have a different perspective. And in Russia, for example, a lot of people say that the West did not keep its promises, in particular with regards to NATO expansion to the east. And there you can also hear grumbling about the unnecessary humiliation of Russia in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, instead of having some kind of a German Marshall Plan, like initiative to rebuild Russia and integrate it into the new international system. So what do you say to that?
First of all, I very much respect that view because it reflects a deeply rooted feeling in Russia. And it falls on quite fruitful grounds in Europe, specifically in Germany. But it doesn't make the narrative much better. And I think we have to deal more with facts than just with certain ideas or certain points that have been constructed in a way which don't come very close to the truth. Let me say one thing first. Of course, we have not dealt with, from a NATO and from a Western perspective, with all developments properly. And some of our steps were quite suboptimal. Just as an example, the way we dealt with and we communicated the missile defense system was certainly has not been conducted very well. Same is true for our debate we have had for NATO accession of Ukraine and Georgia. It was Germany, by the way, that actually was strictly opposing that very point at the Bucharest summit a couple of years ago. Getting back to your points you have made, humiliation, a broken promise. And I took the chance to talk to many of the people who were in charge in Germany and in other countries in Europe, member states of the European Union now, right after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I was seeking more or less desperately for a promise and looking for it and looking for a promise that may have been written down anywhere or that would have been stated specifically before 1991. And there was no such promise. And there was never a head of state who actually made that promise. And it's one of the witnesses who actually underwrites that very fact is Mikhail Gorbachev, who also said this has never been given, that promise. And it was especially not stated before 1991. And that's one of the things we have to keep in mind here as well. So that's on the promise. On the humiliation, I do understand a feeling and an idea in Russia to be encircled suddenly by NATO, by American troops and others. But again, we have to look at the facts here. How many American soldiers are actually in the Central East and Eastern European countries being based there? They're less than in the Netherlands. It's if you look at the overall numbers. How many attempts have been made to include Russia also in existing NATO infrastructures? So we have formed together with Russia the NATO-Russia Council. We have invited Russia, as we have invited, as NATO, as we have invited all the new member states at a certain point. And they were seeking this accession by themselves. And it was a decision that had been made in these countries, but by themselves, to join the Partnership for Peace, PFP, with NATO, to join a European partnership. It's in that very regard as well. It was declined by Russia. Well, it's the decision of Russia to do so. But I would say that's not a case of humiliation. Russia was observer in many in many cases. We worked together on topics where we had a shared and still have a shared interest, maybe counter narcotics, maybe counter terrorism and all the other things. So this on NATO. Secondly, on the notion which I expressed rather bluntly, where I said, well, it has been dramatically lost, the Cold War by Russia. The Cold War. And the question, how do you treat a quote-unquote loser or someone who has lost a war? And just the fact that Russia, of course, took the Security Council seat of the Soviet Union was, you could say that's normal, and that was, as a nuclear power, that was should have been one thing, sure. Not to be discussed. But we also, in 2008, and I think that's a very crucial date, Russia was accepted as a G8 member without even fulfilling at that very time, without fulfilling economic and other things.
So you're not
the criteria.
Really.
So and you could prolong the list at WTO. You could prolong the list to German Russia councils, European Russia Council, etc. So mistreating is something different. Mistreating is something different.
Well, thank you for this. And Ambassador Churkin, well, I suspect that you're not in full agreement with just about everything that the KT.
Surprise,
no,
surprise.
I'm not, but I was very curious to hear sort of the Russian perspective described by the German colleague. It does not necessarily. First of all, I don't think we need to use words like humiliation, or even blame. I mean, it's not about blame. If we want to get out of it, we need to analyze how the entire thing happened. And I personally, having been incidentally not only the first spokesman of the Russian ministry, but more importantly under the current circumstances, the last spokesman of the Soviet foreign ministry, I was not feeling humiliated. I don't think humiliation was the thing. But we really need to remember and analyze how it all happened. And we should not be saying that all the things which were done by Germany, the United States, the West were bad things. Some of them were good things, including recently, I mean, Russia joining WTO, I think, after 17 years, I think, of negotiation, and there was indeed some help towards the end from the Obama administration to help us join WTO. I mean, it's questionable how useful it is for us, but we were asking for it, and it did happen. But overall, I mean, some milestones need to be remembered. Of course, the Cold War, and I don't like speaking about defeat, especially, excuse me, coming from a German politician after the Soviet Union's very positive supporting role for reunification of Germany, one of the major symbols of the end of the Cold War. For Germany to believe that the Soviet Union was defeated in the Cold War, frankly, to me, it's not fair. And it does not give enough credit to the Soviet Union, to Gorbachev, for the role he played in allowing the Cold War to end. But I think we remember that the Cold War ended on the promise of a common European home. There was the summit, November 1990 in Paris. The common European home was, and Gorbachev was there, all the European leaders, President of the United States. That was the promise of the next stage in international relations. We had at that time a rather peculiar, esoteric, one might think, discussion, what should be the basis of European security. We were saying OSCE, NATO was saying, no, it's NATO. So that was the beginning of problems. When instead of trying to build this common roof, there was an effort to beef up and expand sort of the Western sphere of influence. For us, it was a serious argument, and some important political decisions needed to be taken. In fact, first, during a visit to Poland, under the pressure of Lech Walesa, President Yeltsin allowed a statement to be included, a communique, basically saying that Russia did not mind the inclusion of Poland into NATO. Then the line was corrected, and he wrote a letter to a number of key Western leaders saying, wait a minute. And I think the key clause in this letter, quite an ambitious goal, was that he was hoping that the pace of the development of relations between Russia and NATO would even outpace NATO's relations with East European countries, and that in turn will satisfy their security concerns if they had any. Also a controversial thing for us, and incidentally, I was liaison ambassador to NATO from 94 to 98, so I remember quite vividly, some of those things. Whether to participate in Partnership for Peace and some other arrangements for NATO. A controversial thing back in Moscow, we decided to participate, but our premise was that things will not lead to chipping off to NATO enlargement step by step, etc., etc. Again, even during that period, relations were quite cooperative. Some useful things were happening. Founding Act of 1997, in May of 1997, Yeltsin, Chirac, Solana, the whole thing in Paris. Then what you mentioned, that was the joint Russia-NATO Council. Another step of NATO in our direction. The joint NATO-Russia Council was reformed. Actually, we lost our co-chairmanship in order to become integrated in the entire structure of NATO. There were supposed to be joint decisions coming out. By that time, I think there was already 19 members of NATO, like not a group of 19, but a group of 20 would be preparing joint decisions. It never happened. It never happened. So we lost our co-chairmanship. We got nothing for that. I suppose that gesture was made in order to make the next wave of expansion of NATO more palatable for us. So this trend of NATO enlargement continued, which was strategically very unpleasant to us. And an indication that you were not about building a common European home. You were about
so are you regretting this? Like President Putin says once famously quoted that the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century is the fall of the Soviet
this is a
Union?
different thing. The disintegration of the Soviet Union already happened by that time. How you describe a disaster, greatest or not greatest, it's a secondary matter in my view. And for many of us, for us it was the greatest geopolitical disaster of our lifetime, for those of us who live there. But what I'm saying is that even though from time to time some positive things were happening, that's that thing of creeping expansion of the West without taking into account properly the interests of Russia. That was our sense. And then our relations with the European Union also got stuck. Like efforts to acquire a visa-free regime were blocked. An effort to sign a new agreement to replace between Russia and the European Union, to replace the one which your obedient servant initialed back in 1994, were blocked. The proposal to form, you said European Union, a European Union-Russia Council, which was proposed by Chancellor Merkel, that was blocked by some members of the European Union. So already there was this feeling of frustration that we are not being understood. The United States abrogated the ABM Treaty, very serious strategic challenge to the Russian Federation, simply on the promise that certain things are not going to be targeted at us or aimed at us. For us, this is not a serious strategic argument. And the final thing, and I think it's impossible to understand what happened in Ukraine and the current situation without this kind of a preambular part, a very crude handling of the situation in Ukraine, very crude handling. When the European Union was even refusing to talk to Russia about what is going in Ukraine, what is going to happen in Ukraine. When European and American politicians started pressing flesh, marching up and down streets in Kyiv, demanding that Yanukovych should sign that European Association Agreement, without even listening to what, and Russia was only saying, let's have consultations, trilateral consultations, discuss what the consequences of that should be. Well, toppling a legal president. Now, probably Ukraine we're going to talk about later, but since you mentioned Crimea, for instance, to me, and there can be legal arguments, political argument, to me the strongest argument was the result of opinion polls which were conducted by German opinion poll organizations 2 weeks ago in Crimea. How people feel about reunification with Russia. 93% said yes. 4% said no.
Thank you very much.
To me, that was a definitive argument about the whole thing.
The opinion polls, you must admit, are not deeply entrenched in the national law. But I'm going to now move on to Kevin, because Kevin wrote in his article for Horizons, for the last issue of Horizons, he wrote about leadership. And he talked about leaders that perceive the world around them in a certain way, and that this affects their judgment and their actions. Well, obviously we see from these two beginnings that there are different perceptions. And this is probably shared by not only them, but also by leaders in Moscow, by leaders in the West. Well, how do you think that perceptions and misperceptions, if you will, of leaders in the West and Russia contribute to the Ukrainian crisis?
Well, in answering that question, I bring all the wisdom of the Asian hemisphere and a lack of familiarity with the hemisphere about which we're speaking. So let me seek to synthesize to the extent that I can. I think, look, your question is a problem. Your question was who's to blame. That's always easy to answer in the political process. Everyone's already intrinsically, psychologically and emotionally reached their own conclusion. Usually that guy, and never me. I think the wiser question to ask on such complex questions as Russia, the Ukraine, NATO, the US and the rest is how did this happen and what are its intrinsic causes? And if we reflect on that for a moment, maybe we can start to carve out a different pathway for the future. So if I was to answer that question, how do we get here? I think my two answers would be along these lines. One, history created some god-awful circumstances for us. And two, there's been a monstrous failure of our collective diplomacy to deal with the complexities which history has delivered us. And on the question of history, I don't need to recite to an audience like this just how extraordinarily complex the history of the Ukraine is. The ancient history of Kievan Rus, the more recent history, Khrushchev's decision of '54, post-91 identity, and then this period that we've had, particularly over the last decade, where you have seen a deep fracturing, step by step, of trust between the US and Russia. And I would submit probably beginning with the invasion of Iraq, way before the events of the current period. And so if no one in politics and in foreign policy decision making arrives at a decision in a vacuum, it's an accumulation of all these things. And so I think we need to be fully mindful of complexity before we reach rapid conclusions about who's to blame or not, rather than how did we get here. Which brings me to my second point, which goes to leadership, and my remark, a failure of collective diplomacy. For me, the beginning of wisdom in diplomacy is to understand how the other person views reality. That's the first step. And in our hemisphere, we are required to do that on a daily basis. How does China perceive this reality? How does India perceive this reality? How does Indonesia perceive this reality? And if you are a Western country in the East, as we are, Australia, then frankly, we're faced with this complexity every day. Everyone brings a different cultural and civilizational tradition to bear in their perception of who's to blame, who's right, who's wrong, or how has this come about. So let me go to the concrete questions of perceptions as it relates, strategic perceptions as it relates to what has unfolded in the Ukraine. As I look at it as an outsider, what I see in the period of the 90s is an absence of what I would describe as effective magnanimity on the part of the collective West to Russia in its post-91 circumstances. People will argue against that in the administration. I've had those discussions at Aspen and elsewhere. But frankly, the test of it is Russian public opinion, and that's how Russian public opinion viewed the 90s. That's just a reality. We could wish the Russian people didn't conclude that, but even from the distance of Australia, I remember the footage of the food queues in the winter. I remember the desperation in people's eyes, and I think, well, there must be a better way to handle this. Then you roll on to, I think, the second set of bad perceptions, which is the decision to invade Iraq, which Russia, rightly or wrongly through its history, has been seen as a country which is of strategic relevance to it. And the decision unilaterally by the US to roll into Iraq, which I think was profoundly unwise, not least because of the violation of international law, but because of unintended consequences, which we're still dealing with in the Security Council as of today, in what has unfolded in Iraq a decade plus later. This was a deep breach, I think, in a US perception, or deep failure of US perception of how central these adjacent theatres were to Russia's historical strategic sense of its own interests. There's a deep and fundamental sense of breach of trust, I think. And just to finish on that point. And so you roll through to Bucharest and in 2008 and the huge debate on NATO expansion in relation to Georgia, in relation to Ukraine. You might be surprised to know I happened to be there as the Australian Prime Minister, because the afternoon session was in Afghanistan, the morning session was about this grand debate. And I remember talking to President Bush at the time over the lunch break between the Georgia and Ukraine discussion and the subsequent discourse on Afghanistan with a wider group, that is, the rest of us who are engaged in the Afghanistan war. And I remember a discussion that I had with President Bush along the lines of, why are you expanding NATO this far? I mean, I'm no NATO expert, I'm from the other side of the world, and I know the in-principle response is that any country which seeks membership, of course, should be free to do so, and then it's a NATO collective decision to decide whether they're in. But applying what I see in our part of the world, it struck me as a curious decision to begin to put this at the absolute forefront of the collective interests of the US and the West. And I'll just conclude on this point. If we're to learn something from this about how we then problem solve into the future, the beginning of wisdom is to understand intrinsically and through our diplomacy what our other interlocutors' bottom lines actually are. We may not agree with them, but they're there. And then the second lesson of diplomacy is, what are our priorities? Kissinger wrote about this. Are our priorities war or peace, or are our priorities something lesser than that?
Okay, we're going to go back to the priorities. I need to speed you up, gentlemen, because Jeff, you were there right after the Berlin Wall collapsed in Eastern Europe, first in Poland and then in the Russian Federation. What's your take on that period as we're speaking about the roots of this crisis?
I think there's no doubt that we wasted a historic opportunity and that we're living through the consequences of that today. And I was there 26 years ago and watched it very closely and was very puzzled by it. And it took me 26 years to understand better what happened, I have to say, and I'll explain why very briefly. When I became advisor to the Polish government after the June 4th democratic elections in 1989, I recommended some very radical measures to help them get out of a debt crisis and a hyperinflation. And one of those, for example, was an appeal for emergency financial relief for Poland. And I created a kind of special fund, $1 billion, to help stabilize the Polish economy. Well, when I thought of that specific proposal one morning in September 1989, I called Senator Dole, who was the majority leader. And I said, Senator, I have an idea. He said, come on in. I described the idea to him. He said, can you come back in an hour? I came back in an hour, and there was General Scowcroft. And he said, please explain to General Scowcroft your idea. General Scowcroft was the National Security Advisor. So I explained the idea of this stabilization fund to General Scowcroft, and he said, call back later in the afternoon. I called back at 5 in the afternoon, and Senator Dole said, well, you've got your $1 billion. Tell your friends that you've got your $1 billion. So it was raising $1 billion in about 8 hours from literally putting a piece of paper in a IBM printer, first vintage.
That was back then when $1 billion was a lot of money.
Now, $1 billion here and there doesn't matter very much, but now, fast forward 2 years later, President Yeltsin and especially Yegor Gaidar had asked me to come for help, and Russia had a fulminant financial disaster on its hands. I had actually tried a year before to help President Gorbachev, but the West was completely uninterested in discussing anything financial with President Gorbachev. Left him completely empty-handed. So this was November 1991 in Moscow, and I made recommendations that were very close to what had been successful by then in Poland and understood to have been very successful. Every single thing I recommended was turned down by the White House and by the IMF. I was completely puzzled by it. I thought this was an economics argument. I tried to explain the economics of it again, how you end a chaotic situation like this. Made no headway. A couple of months afterwards, I was on McNeil-Lehrer one evening with Larry Eagleburger, who was then the acting Secretary of State. And he said, Jeff, I want to give you a ride back to town after we finished in the studio. And Eagleburger said, in a nutshell, he said, just let's say I agreed with your analysis, just for purposes of argument. And he said, it's interesting, you know, Leszek Balcerowicz, the Polish finance minister, was in town last week. He said the same thing about how we should help Russia, just the same as you. But I just want to tell you something as a friend. Well, never listen to that. Anyway, but he said, I just want to tell you something. It's not going to happen. Do you hear me? It's not going to happen. It didn't happen. We did not give help to Russia. It was a disaster, and there were years of hyperinflation, chaos, and so forth. I was there. I know it. I saw it day by day. I was puzzled by it profoundly. I was naive because at that moment, turns out, looking back 25 years, is when the defense minister of the United States, Mr. Richard Cheney, and his deputy, Mr. Wolfowitz, were putting together their unipolar world view. Just at that moment, the idea we were going to help Russia was the farthest thing in their minds, unimaginable. And there's a wonderful couple of pages in a new book by Wesley Clark that is really worth pondering. Because Wesley Clark was then a general in one of the military schools, and he was in the Pentagon, and he was walking down the corridor, and he was passing Wolfowitz's office, and just spontaneously knocked on the door to see his good friend Paul, and opened the door. And Wolfowitz was explaining to him this new military doctrine. And Wolfowitz said to him, we learned something from the Gulf War, the 1990 Gulf War. We learned we can do anything, and the Soviet Union will do nothing. There will be no response. We have total freedom of action. And Clark says, what's the implication of that? He says, well, we're going to act. We're going to use this. What do you mean? Well, we're going to, one by one, take out all of the Soviet allies in the Middle East, Iraq, Syria, others, because we can now clean up the Middle East. And Clark, you have to read this. This is General Clark. This is not Jeffrey Sachs describing this. General Clark says, what do you mean, Paul? You mean war? He said, well, war if it has to be. Why? Well, because if we don't move in, somebody else could move in. What do you mean? China? Yeah, China. We've got to take advantage of this unique moment. It's really an extraordinary couple of pages. Just to finish, we've been playing out this scenario faster or slower for 25 years. It's crazy. We've invaded one country after another when the opportunity arose. When there were demonstrations against Assad in 2010, who was, I'm not defending him, but we said, okay, we'll take him out. We took out Saddam when we didn't like it. We took out Gaddafi when we decided it wasn't convenient. We've spread NATO. Look, this is real politics. It's real politics bathed in a world of rhetoric of international law.
I got to stop you there. You're not going to continue promoting Wes Clark's book tonight.
Another publication we're talking about.
Thank you. But no. On a serious side, this was really fascinating, a first-hand account. But since you were talking about the economy, I'm going to go now to Vitaly and ask him about the economic situation. One of the most striking consequences of the Ukrainian crisis has been the position of an increasingly stringent set of sanctions by the West on Russia. And Ian Bremmer, another Horizons author, by the way, calls this the weaponization of finance by the United States and its allies, the increasing use of economic carrots and perhaps even more so of economic sticks. to incentivize the behavior of states in the international system. So how crippling are these sanctions on Russia? And what's your take? Can Russia sustain its economy long term under the circumstances?
Before I try to answer, may I make a more general comment? As I was listening, it occurred to me that some of us understand the end of the Cold War differently. To me, the end of the Cold War is the fall of the Berlin Wall and reunification of Germany. To some others, I understand, the end of the Cold War is disintegration of the Soviet Union. And this is very important, because if you feel that you won in the Cold War when the Soviet Union disintegrated, you don't want to lose the consequences of your victory. You want to keep Russia down. And this is exactly what has happened. One element, and frankly, I'm not like help or not help, economic help. After all, it was not our right to expect, American economic help. But what was our right to expect is to respect, for you, whoever else, to respect our interests, to respect the fact that Russia was a great country, and Russia had a country with extensive relationship with its neighbors. But what we saw, that every step or every effort Russia was taking in order to create new system around itself after the disintegration of the Soviet Union was opposed by the United States and the West. Commonwealth of Independent States was never really recognized. CSTO, this for collective security, was never recognized, even to the point that our proposals to work jointly with NATO and Afghanistan and them on drug trafficking has been rejected for 10 years. This is one of the core issues, that not only was the West expanding, but they were refusing to accept the right of Russia to take care of its interest in its neighborhood, which was, in our view, not only in our interest, but also in the interest of our neighbors. Many of them would not be able to survive these days, like in Central Asian countries, had it not been for some of our joint arrangements with us. Now, Vuk, very quickly, your question. I'm not an economist. I suppose sanctions hurt. I know in the European Union, our measures also hurt. They hurt the capability, the economic relationship between Russia and the European Union, which is hugely larger, I think to the tune of $400 billion, $30 billion with the United States. So the United States can do this geopolitical things and allow, European Union and Russia to hurt. We'll adjust, no doubt about it. It's not the end of the world. Now, this weaponization of finances, I believe it's wrong. I believe it's ultimately it's going to hurt the United States, because it's going to hurt the role of the United States in the dollar, et cetera, because people, of course, will be looking, as they do now already, for different ways of doing business. And frankly, it's not fair. You expect people to act with a certain degree of fairness. Since the United States was given by the international community the special status, they are printing the green ones. This is for people to allow the normal economic interaction. This is not to put economic pressure on them, depending on various geopolitical considerations.
Well, I'm going to move back to KT. And KT, you hold a unique distinction of being both German defense and economy minister. And Germany is now the economic powerhouse of Europe and the biggest partner of Russia in the European Union. So what do you think are now the consequences for Germany and for Europe of this ongoing fallout between Russia and the West?
The consequences are severe. There's no doubt about this. It's for instance, Germany's dependence on Russian energy resources is enormous. 30% of our demand we have in Germany. For instance, we have extremely close ties in many industrial sectors established during the last 25, 26 years, and even before that. And the sanctions regimes hurts the German economy quite severely. Nevertheless, the major players in the German business community has agreed upon those sanctions, and it hurts us. But the consequence of an ongoing and lasting war scenario next to our borders would hurt our economic interests even more. So that may sound like a banality and like a truism, but that's the debate we're in right now. And then, of course, we have to take care as a European community also of European interests and the interests of its European member states. And Ambassador Churkin, you have just said before that you most rightly expect respect from our side and from the West for Russian interests, and also for your interests in regarding your neighbors, where those are neighbors we have in common. And those are neighbors where we also have a European interest of stability, of sovereignty, of territorial integrity, of core values that are part of a European idea we have tried to build up after the disaster Germany was responsible for in the last century. And this is why we are struggling that much with the situation we are in right now. And this is one of the reasons why you find the support you see right now for the sanctions for the sake of reaching a situation where we could work again on a partnership with Russia that serves both of our interests. So it's not about excluding Russia from a prospering Europe, which is obviously not prospering right now. And even in Germany, we're dancing on thin ice economically. But the main goal is to come back to a situation where we could form partnerships, where we could form a balance and an equilibrium to work together again. And this is not taking place right now, obviously not.
So I'm gonna jump to Kevin, and there are a lot of people who are saying, perhaps in a simplistic way, well, Russia is definitely loser economically from this, and Europe is a loser economically, and everybody's losing long term. But there's perhaps one winner coming out of this situation, and that winner is China. You're an expert in China, and Russia and China seem to be growing much closer together as a result of what has been going on. Do you think it's a fair assessment, and has China really benefited as a result of this?
I think the truth of it, Vuk, is that the personal relationship between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin is strong, and that's the result of a number of factors. One of them is a common disagreement with what's been described earlier by Jeffrey as American claims at various points in recent decades of one form of unipolarity over another. The catch cry in their dialogue between the two is always about the need for greater multipolarity in the international system, and they do not see this as evident in aspects of US global behavior. So at a deep level, this actually causes the two leaders to find a common point. The second is the discussions often, from a Chinese perspective, and as reflected in Chinese media, are about a genuine belief in Beijing, and according to those sources in Moscow, about a US and Western hand in color revolutions plus across, let's call it, not just the former Eastern and Central Europes, but let's call it prospectively in China itself. So from these two, what I describe as aggregate security perspectives, there is a deep commonality of interest which is growing. I think there's a bit of a complacency in this country, the United States, where I now live for the first time in my life, about, frankly, how strong this relationship can become. The key thing which we always lose sight of with China is that in the midst of the chaos of the Tiananmen events of 1989, what did Gorbachev and Deng do in 1989? When they met at that time, they resolved the Russian-Chinese border. It was fixed for history. As a consequence, for that fundamental geopolitical point, the deep stabilization of Russia-China relations began then. So I think there is, despite all the historical reservations, and when I've been in Moscow and you speak to the think tanks, people give you 1,000 historical reasons to why there is Russian continued disquiet about China in the long term. 6 million people living in the Russian Far East, 800 million Chinese living north of the Yangtze, etc. But I think there is a mistake in this country to miscalculate the extent of an emerging strategic cooperation between the two. I do not call it an alliance. I think that is loose language, but there is an emerging commonality of interests. The one point I'd add as a footnote to all that, if the broad question is, what are the consequences of what we now faced, let's call it in the post-Ukraine reality? I mean, what animates me about these questions is what happens to the global order. The global order is a very fragile thing. I mean, we haven't really had one before 1945. We had a new form of it post-91. Where does it go in the future? If you watch CNN of an evening, it seems that the only challenge to the global order is these non-state actors rolling around the place from Xinjiang in the northeast to Boko Haram in the southwest, and the crescent of violent jihadism, which we see across the world. But when you start to see parallel to that, new frictions of a classic state against state reality, these are two sets of huge geopolitical factors bearing down on what has always been, frankly, a fragile order. And when you're dealing with states which are in the nuclear business, I really worry about the collapse of negotiations on ballistic missile defense. I really worry about the retardation of strategic arms limitation talks. I really worry about where the whole nuclear equation goes, because that's been central to our deliberations on the order since the 70s.
Do you think that the United Nations has a role to play in this? And in particular, do you think that the United Nations has a role to play in the Ukraine crisis in making sure that there's a long-term solution and stability?
Well, the United Nations should be engaged directly or indirectly in all questions of fundamental peace and security in accordance with the Charter. That's why we framed the Charter in the way in which we did in 45. No one could say that what is unfolded in the case of the Ukraine is not a deep challenge to peace and security. In the period following this most recent Minsk Accord, we need to look very carefully at the role, and given that that is now been reflected, I think, though I've been travelling for the last 36 hours back from Australia, I think reflected, look at me carefully, Antonio and Vitaly, in a Security Council resolution seeking to entrench the Minsk Agreement. Is that where we've got or not?
Yeah.
Then, under
Yesterday
those...
it was a thumbs up for
Fine, okay, I've been in an aeroplane from Australia. So, therefore, we should not rule out the capacity of the UN through its own peacekeepers to look at a way in which this can be upheld as well. Final point, though, the Charter says these matters can be discharged to regional organisations, and the Charter is alive with what the relationship between the UN itself and what regional institutions are capable of doing. So I'm not party to what the Security Council has done in the last 48 hours, but there is a role. And if there's not a role, we have a problem at mill. And that means the UN must be central to the post-45 order. If not, we don't have an order.
Well, thanks for that. Jeff, looking forward, looking to the future, you as an outsider, academic, somebody who knows the background, somebody who's a keen follower of everything that's going on in the world, including the very, very big picture, what is, in your view, needed? What are the parameters of the solution? How to move forward? How to de-escalate the Russia-West crisis?
I think it's really important to see the Russia-West crisis as part of the general spread of war over the last 15 years. So I would go back to Kosovo, I would go to Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya. We have Syria. There is a tremendous amount of destabilization, and there is very, very little resort to international law. We're seeing great power politics. Great power politics is extraordinarily dangerous. It can lead to disaster. The idea of international law is self-restraint by powers, and the idea that that leads to mutual security. We gave that up after 1991 in this country at a deep level. And actually, I do believe probably President Obama struggles with his security apparatus every day, which would like more war, more war, more war. And I think the president's main role is to try to stop what is the bureaucratic machinery of a security state from moving even farther and faster and militarizing more than we have right now. But why do we have spreading war everywhere? The whole Middle East is in flames. The Horn of Africa is in flames. Libya is in flames. Because not once are we really respecting the rules. We say NATO acts whether or not the UN Security Council deems it correct. The United States has reserved the right to launch any war of its choice. A lot of them are secret, so the American public doesn't even know what we're doing. This is really true, and it's a very serious problem. There isn't a good sense of where we're fighting, how we're fighting, what we're fighting right now, but it's a lot, and it's not under anything of the Charter. Now, Russia, the same way right now. You know, I do not accept the Ukraine situation as acceptable in any kind of normative response. I just think that it is, after lots of provocations, understandable in the way that Kevin Rudd said we need to understand things. I don't find it acceptable. I find that the great powers are acting like great powers. They're not acting like the P5 in a Security Council, as we would normatively like to behave for safety. Now, as an American, I have to say, not only do I just feel a lot endangered by our behavior. I don't feel that I've been made safe at all. I don't like the fact that as a taxpayer, I've had to pay trillions of dollars for these stupid wars. But I feel very endangered everywhere I go now, because I travel a lot and I go to these troubled places and there's a mess everywhere. So I don't feel I'm getting my money's worth out of my government right now, if I could put it that way. That it's actually, my security state is not making me secure. It's making me deeply insecure. And I resent that, actually. So in this sense, I just want to say that we are at the 70th year of the United Nations. We're past the 1945 settlement. We should be past the 1991 illusion of the unipolar world. This was the fantasy world of Cheney and Wolfowitz. Nobody was more dangerous to our republic than Mr. Cheney. But the legacy lives on. And we've got to get past the unipolar idea, stop deciding when we want to overthrow a government or not overthrow a government, and stop saying it's all the other side doing it. And then with Russia, we have so many common interests. This is the irony. You think we don't share common interests in stopping ISIS? Of course we do. Common interests in stopping the great instability in the Middle East? That's Russia's fear too. We have no differences fundamentally, except we couldn't stop ourselves when we had it good, we thought. So take everything off the table. So if we want to be safe, we have to pull back and say, as Mr. Gutenberg writes, he says tacitly NATO's off the table for Ukraine. Well, I don't agree with that because it's not off the table. Every NATO leader constantly says it's still on the table. If it's really off the table, let's be clear it's off the table as part of a real Ukraine settlement.
But we live in a world with which we're trying to preserve sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. Do you think it's right to impose a choice on a sovereign nation like Ukraine when it comes to their strategic outlook? If they want to join NATO, why would a sovereign nation be prevented from exercising this choice?
Because NATO creates externalities. NATO's not like choosing that I want to have a Toyota or a Honda. NATO is a military alliance. So if you join a military alliance, it's actually against someone else, despite what NATO says. You know, gee, it's great, I have NATO on my borders, but they assure me that they're perfectly innocent. Well, if it's also innocent, let's not even have NATO, frankly.
Russia would be happy.
I'm going to move now to Katie. Katie, do you agree about this proposition? should Ukraine be allowed to exercise the right of a sovereign nation to choose their future? Or is this perhaps something that has further implications and externalities? And what is, in your opinion, the future? I mean, what would be acceptable for Germany and for Europe when it comes to the solution of this crisis?
First of all, Ukraine, of course, has the right to choose an option. Whether an institution agrees on that is a very different thing. And in that very respect, regardless what we think about NATO or whether we like it or not, and I'm probably the last defender here of that very institution with all its flaws it has, and there are many. I would like to see in that very context at least a number of core NATO member states speaking out clearly that there is no interest in accession of Ukraine. And you won't see that coming from Poland, and you won't see that coming from the Baltic states, and you won't see that probably also coming from the US. But I don't think we would overstretch our capacities, for instance, in Germany or in France and other places, to say this is not in our security interest because we are importing insecurity into NATO, and that's not part of the structural thoughts we have had with and for NATO. And that was one of the reasons why we have opposed in 2008 in Bucharest, Georgia and Ukraine's accession.
How did it get there if you oppose? Because 2008 said Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. If Germany opposed, how did this phrase get in there, in that communique?
Well, you do remember that at the end it didn't happen. And it was a phrase we were fighting for quite a bit.
To me, it's a very far-reaching phrase. If Germany were opposing, I don't know if it would have happened.
Well, you should
it's a consensus institution.
Why aren't you just for just a moment realizing?
Just shut up.
No,
Vitaly, I need to reprimand you on this. Katie, it's your floor. Sorry.
Just kidding.
Vitaly, this guy here, Germany at the time actually prevented that decision from occurring.
No, but Katie hasn't finished.
That is what happened in 2008.
First of all, the decision did not happen because we were standing against it. Secondly, I just love to have diplomats who still remember that diplomatic language could also be an asset. And I don't think we come further.
I was referring to myself. Everybody understood it. I was not saying that to you. I was saying that you were saying that to me. No, I'm sorry if you.
Thank you guys for spicing it up, but I would like to hear Katie finish.
I was putting words in your mouth. Sorry, you misunderstood me.
As I did before with the Russian soul, of course.
Sure.
On the way ahead. And I think our interest is really to find a solution that does not bring us into any deterioration of where we are right now. I endorse, against some hawks over here, the attempts by Chancellor Merkel and President Hollande to come to conclusion, may it be in a Minsk 3, 4, or 25. And we should try again and again, even if it doesn't work the second time. And many say that Minsk 2 is dead already. I would say it's in agony right now. And we have seen breaches again, where many players are involved, of course. But we do also see that certain things have to stop. And this is just igniting again and again a situation which should come to a certain restaurant. And the question of delivering arms is not only a question we have to ask the American administration, it's also a question we have to ask Russia. And we have to come to an understanding that, of course, in war times, the truth is the first that dies. But that instead of constant mutual finger pointing, we are also willing to accept that we have been untrue regarding certain issues. For instance, again and again, the notion from the Russian side that you're not delivering arms to the separatists is just not true. It is happening. And it's even part of the Minsk Accord in the meantime. So there are rocket launches that only exist in Russia. They are part of the withdrawal act in the Minsk Accord. So finally we are there. Why not speaking it out? and starting at the point where the truth is the matter of fact, and not constantly trying to say, there's something happening, there's something, we're not going anywhere. So I think it makes sense that we have a couple of players in the European Union right now who don't want to escalate the situation.
Absolutely.
I think it makes sense to try again and again to talk to each other, and even to pick up the phone. It would make sense to have, within global powers, leaders who don't seem to be detached from other leaders. You don't have to look too far for that very factor. And it would make a lot of sense if, and I come back to the point, if we could all agree that territorial integrity and sovereignty is a factor that counts in international standards. And there we are back at the United Nations, at the role of the OSCE and all the other things. So it is a hard way to go. I'm utterly pessimistic at the very moment that we reach something very soon in that very regard.
So, but there's a process.
But we should not give up. And we should not send the harshest measures or take the harshest measures imaginable. Like now, what does sending weapons, arms?
Absurd.
What does it bring us?
Sure.
Let me just finish that thought, because I think this is one where we are struggling right now between the European member states and also with certain parts in Washington. Of course, I was surprised that Germany threw away the token without necessity as a real politics token for negotiations, as they said immediately this is not going to take place. But I understand the argument, because this is not a war that could be won by weapons. This will just be an endless mess and bloodshed. And therefore, I think that's what's happening right now with certain members of the European Union makes sense and should be fostered, but it needs a willingness in Moscow as well to play by the rules and to also turn in at a certain point.
Thanks, Katie. Vitaly, what's the parameters of the solution? What is needed to have a solution from the Russian perspective?
In Ukraine or globally?
Ukraine and the Russia-West relations that has soured as a result of the Ukraine crisis.
In Ukraine, I think they found a formula which should work. And indeed, we did have this very important resolution, in fact, proposed by Russia, adopted yesterday unanimously in the Security Council, endorsing the Minsk agreement, so it should work. There is not much of a room for the United Nations there because OSCE is involved, has been involved throughout the crisis. I've had some good news that actually they are beginning to pull back heavy weapons, etc., etc. So it's going to be a painful process, but we have very strong commitment by the four leaders, supported by the Security Council. So I think the international ingredients are there, but it's kind of a messy situation. Now, on a global scale, I think, well, first of all, we need to try to learn lessons, some of which we have been discussing today. And nobody's perfect. I'm not claiming that Russia has been always perfect, or I think that the West definitely has done some good things down the road, or some important countries from the West have been sort of trying to do good things to Russia. We need to look for areas of mutual interest and remember our responsibility. And I think really, believe me, Russia is a responsible member of the international community. I am frankly a little bit even surprised how, despite all this trouble, our people diligently continue to work very hard in those nuclear talks with Iran, 6+1. It would not take much for Russia to do some mischief in those talks, believe me, in order to make agreement even much more difficult than it is currently now. Now, today we were discussing Libya in the Security Council. We have a lot of grievances from our experience from 4 years ago in the Security Council. But clearly there is an effort, I can tell you, an effort from Russia to try to generate common work for Libya, of the Security Council, international community, in order to try to stabilize the situation, which hopefully will also pick up further on. And there are many other issues. We could have been, I believe, a member of this US-led international coalition against ISIL had the United States decided to go to the Security Council. And I hope I'm not divulging much of a secret, and I see somebody who should know sitting in the room. We did have conversations with my good friend and colleague Samantha Power about it, and she was wondering whether to go to the Security Council or not. And it was not because of Russia's resistance that the United States decided not to go to the Security Council. I suppose it had something to do with their kind of difficulties with Syria, et cetera, et cetera. So Russia is prepared to look for areas of mutual interest. I hope the United States is prepared too. Also, I think, in addition to other things, and speaking about this Russia-China relationship, the United States, I've said a number of times over many years that there is, I believe this, maybe not entirely seriously, but I think it's a fundamental problem. The United States believes in its exceptionalism, and it has to say at every corner that the United States is going to lead. Fine, I am prepared to sort of listen to those statements. If they want to position themselves this way, why, what the hell? But they should not proceed from this premise in their relations with Russia and China, really. Because they should take advantage of our willingness to cooperate. I can give you one example of something which is happening even now. The United States announced it's beginning today and will continue tomorrow. This summit in Washington, they called. In fact, it's not summit, it's more modest, ministerial level, but still an important meeting on fighting extremism. American-led effort to fight extremism, international effort. They did not consult us. Originally, they did not even invite us. You know, they invited OEC without inviting Serbia, which is chairman in office of OEC. Instead, they invited Kosovo, you know, which is not a member of the United Nations. As far as I'm concerned, it's going to produce a mess. And in a situation where we are eager to work together with the United States. So at the last moment, the Russian delegation is still flying to Washington. I hope they can make it, because we were completely confused about the entire arrangement, because the United States wants to lead, you know, and you know, push aside the United Nations. This is wrong, especially fighting extremism. You know, United Nations should be the one who is leading in extremism. If the United States is going to try to lead, it's going to only to attract the extremists, you know, to fight that American-led coalition. So we need to take those things into account. And believe me, the possibility of working together is out there, We need to overcome this crisis. Hopefully, we need to learn some lessons, and we need to start with a new beginning.
Thank you, Vitaly. And I want to give chance to people to ask questions, because you said so many things that I'm sure is going to, you know, provoke some of the people here to ask some questions. But since you guys asked for a very
1 minute.
Just very briefly, so that we give a chance to the audience to ask a couple of questions.
When you convened your conference in Belgrade last year, on the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of the First World War, what was one of the seminal conclusions of the conference? It was the necessity of effective diplomacy, the effectiveness, the necessity for effective crisis management, to prevent something local from becoming something much wider and, in fact, what turned out to be global. This is based on not just misperceptions, failed diplomacy, and an inability for any mechanism to manage a crisis down rather than allow it to, frankly, escalate up. And that's, I think, basically the lesson of Sarajevo summed up in 3 short Australian sentences. So 100 years on, if our beginning premise here is that, given the Ukraine and the reality of what we now face today, the seminal learning must be one of how we manage and quarantine. And when I look at the rest of the global order and the pressures it is under, frankly, if there is one core message, is that given all the other challenges to the order, and not just in peace and security, but more broadly, and certainly what has just been referred to in terms of the ISIS, ISIL, Daesh, global jihadism threat, non-state actors in this massive zone across the world, then frankly, I think the international community and the peoples of the world expect us to quarantine and manage what we are dealing with in this deep dispute between states, and to preserve the functioning of the rest of the order. And if we allow this to creep and creep and creep to the point where it actually envelops all, then there'll be no order left to preserve.
Thanks, Jeff, quickly?
I was just going to mention, I think a good psychological insight for the United States is we have a national tournament among American teams, and we call it the World Series. So it's a little odd if you think about it, ladies and gentlemen. It's not really the world. It's ourselves. But seriously, I wanted to say that it's worth looking at this 2008 NATO issue. And I spoke to a leading former foreign minister who was deeply engaged in that just a couple of weeks ago. He had a very interesting insight. He was at the State Department just before, and he was assured, absolutely, the U.S. is not going to push this. No way. And then President Bush went off to Camp David, and somehow over Christmas, it became the U.S. policy. There was only one country pushing it, the U.S., basically, of course. It should be understood that the U.S. operates on two levels, without question. There is a deep pressure, constantly, of expansion. And we have a visible right wing that's part of that, but there's a deep, constant push. And State Department's a very small part of any of that. They're not let in on a lot of this. But then there's a security state, which is very powerful and keeps pushing. They haven't said no to NATO expansion. They still want the victory that is in their hand from 1991. And I think it's really important. This is what threatens, I'm just talking to fellow Americans. This is what's threatening us. We are not really governed so simply by our visible political leaders. We are pushed and pushed into dangerous places where we should not be at all. And we don't have a stopping mechanism that's very easy.
Well, thanks. Just a quick disclaimer. Jeff is a member of the board of the CIRSD. But it's not that we fully endorse or support all of his views. I just
Nobody
want
endorses what I say.
Yeah. No, sorry. Now, on a serious note, I would like to give an opportunity to people to ask questions from the audience. Any questions?
Sure.
Ben.
Hi.
Hi.
So I got to say the somewhat ludicrous proposition that there is moral equivalence between the U.S. and the Russian stance in Ukraine was something that I expected to hear from the ambassador who denied the role of Russian separatists, the shoot-down of MH17, not from the esteemed professor at Columbia. But on that question, on the question of MH17, when the independent report is released in August, what will Russia do in response, and what consequences, I'm curious from the rest of the audience here, the rest of the panel, what consequences would be appropriate?
Well, first, I assume this is a question to me. First of all, speaking from my perspective in the Security Council, I never denied anything. The airliner was shot down, the airliner was shot down on July 17. We immediately endorsed a press statement demanding international independent investigation. Then they wanted a resolution of the Security Council. We made it possible. It was adopted on July 23. Russia included two crucial clauses. First, that it should be independent international investigation. Secondly, that fighting should stop in the area surrounding the crash area. Later, for some reason, the Ukrainians changed their mind. They continued fighting. We insisted they should stop in order to allow the investigators to come in. Now, Australia wanted a resolution of the Security Council on conducting this investigation. I produced a paper, showed it to them, asking, do you want this resolution to be adopted today to provide legal ground for them to move in at the negotiating side? They chose another way. They started negotiating with the Ukrainians. They're negotiating for 10 days, etc., etc. Then there is a lot of dissatisfaction about how it is going on. So we convened the meeting of the Security Council and proposed exactly what a couple of weeks later was proposed by some relatives of the Dutch victims of the crash, to think about setting up an office of special representative of the Secretary General to strengthen the investigation, because we felt that the preliminary report, and I was trying to do my best not to criticize the Dutch investigation. They are suffering after this horrible thing. We need to be polite to them. But it was very timid. It was not going into many areas. And they kept too many things secret. They have this criminal investigation when they reportedly they concluded an agreement among themselves for countries that they will release things only if they have common agreement on releasing things. You know what that disaster happened, tragedy, when the Polish president crashed in Russia. Very quickly we released, for example, the entire transcript of air controllers' conversations to the last tragic seconds of the crash. They have never done anything like that. Why they couldn't release even the transcript of air traffic controllers? So speaking from my perspective, and I'm being very serious about it, we have done everything and immediately in the Security Council in order to facilitate the investigation. Now, what they're going to come up with, we'll see. We'll see. When they come up with a report, if some kind of conclusions, we'll deal with the consequences of that report. That's the only answer I can give. Well, what I did, well, listen, if you want to go into details, what the Ukrainians did for some reason, immediately after it happened, they put together some scam reports. How can I not to deny authenticity if they showed a book launcher rolling somewhere with 3 missiles, but they overlooked the fact that there is this billboard in the background which shows that it's rolling way west from the place where of course I deny the authenticity. Everybody knows it's a fake. And now nobody even disputes the fact that it's a fake. So they put out a number of fakes immediately. They put together some radio messages. Some of them were sent the day before.
I think we're going into far
no,
details.
I mean, this is a serious accusation, so I want to give you a full answer.
I'd also like to say a word about nobody's making a moral equivalent, but you should also appreciate that about 400,000 Iraqis died as a result of the U.S.-Iraq war of 2003. So I think that these calculations are not so simple and shouldn't be so glib. There is enough blood on everybody's hands right now. We have to get off of this approach, not point that one side is all the evil and the other side not. And that is the point I was making if you were listening.
No, but nobody, I mean, this is, interestingly, this is actually, you could name any subject. It's very hard to expect from like mainstream to accept any kind of moral equivalence, you know. Because it's an exceptional United States. Of course you always have moral superiority. I cannot even claim on any issue any kind of moral equality with the United States. No, this is a serious issue.
That's not a question. No, I'm going to move on from this obviously very toxic topic. Let's go to another question because this is going to be the last question, and then you may be answering, and then you also wrap up the answer any other thing.
Thank you, Professor Sachs. Huge fan of your research. I wish I was able to study under you at Harvard when I was at Harvard.
You should come to Columbia.
So I hesitantly have to question your facts.
Yes.
Consciously. You mentioned you defined the narrative around 1990 where Russia was expected to be abandoned by the U.S. and IMF.
Is that the last
economically, politically. But is that right? I mean, the IMF, with the exception, I think, of the Mexico bailout, issued more loans to Russia in the 90s than anyone. In fact, my understanding, if my research is correct, the only issue the IMF had was not the willingness, U.S.-backed willingness, by the way, publicly by Bill Clinton, willingness to loan to Russia, but I believe their public statement of around $4.5 billion of capital, IMF capital, that had left Russia during the capital flight. So if my numbers are wrong, please correct me, but if they're right, how does that fit into the sort of victimization narrative?
Yeah, your timing is completely wrong and a big misunderstanding. There was a fulminant crisis in 1990, 91, 92, 93. Nothing was done. Nothing. And those were the times when the reformers were trying to do something, starting with Gorbachev himself, who appealed for help at the Houston G7 summit, got zero, went home, faced the putsch. Then soon afterwards, when I came to help President Yeltsin, and the G7 came through and said, just as I could go on for hours, obviously, on this, but the G7 came through in November 1991, and Yegor Gaidar explained to them, we are running out of reserves down to zero. we need to stop because otherwise we're going to have a complete financial explosion, which was correct. They said, don't you dare stop 1 penny a payment or we turn around all of the food shipments on the high seas right now. The U.S. did nothing because it was not interested, knowledgeable, or engaged. And the IMF was a blank slate through 92, 93. It was pathetic. Later on, they gave some money. The reformers were long gone. The corruption was running rampant. It was a disaster, and it was a huge mistake, and it was absolutely, as Larry Eagleburger said it, it's not whether I agree with you or not, Jeffrey, it's not going to happen, and it didn't happen.
Thanks. But this is the very last question, because they're going to kick us out, and I really want to give you a chance to, enjoy and to, have a glass of wine afterwards. So last question.
As long as I've got it, I'm going to ask the question. We've been unfair to the ambassador from Russia. I love Russia. I love Russian music, Russian art. I wouldn't say 92% is probably a little high for Crimea, but
93.
93. What the hell? There is one mysterious thing to a lot of Americans, and myself included, and that is the continuing popularity of Joseph Stalin, and maybe any of the 5 of you would explain why that's the case.
Stalin. So basically, I'm going to give a chance to popularity in Russia, presumably, right?
Yes.
So it's a question for Vitaly, but then also Kevin wanted to say something.
And not about
And not about Stalin. Not about Stalin. Right. What about is Stalin really popular in Russia?
Well, there are those opinion polls. I think I'm upset.
I told you not to go to opinion polls.
I can tell you I'm upset about it. I'm upset about it. But you need to have a political analyst who would probably analyze why it came about. I think it's wrong.
Kevin.
Just a final point, but because the question was raised in the broad debate about moral equivalence on the downing of the aircraft. And look, I think there's a lesson in all this for us. You've got a collapsing order affects innocents everywhere, whether they are innocents in Iraq, innocents in Syria, or innocents in the air. 160 citizens of the Netherlands, 40 citizens of my country, blown out of the sky. And if you want a classic evidence of a order not functioning, that's it. It should not happen. And certainly in my country, and I'm glad to hear what Vitaly just said, we await to hear the final conclusions on this because innocents' lives are simply destroyed. And one final point is this. The last 25 years, if you look at what's happened in post-91 Russia and broader Europe, we've had a global collective failure of diplomatic imagination about what could have been done. You described it, I think, before, Jeff, as a colossal strategic lost opportunity. That's as I see it as well. Given we now have such a smouldering mess, the challenge of diplomacy is A, to quarantine so it doesn't get worse, and B, let's develop a new diplomatic roadmap for the future and reframe the global diplomatic debate about the other fundamental and foundational threats to the order. Because if it collapses, I really worry where we all go after that.
Well, to end on this beautiful note about a worry, I want to first of all thank you, gentlemen, for this exceptional privilege, for this fascinating discussion. I didn't think that we really got close to resolving the issue, but at least I can conclude on a positive note. I can observe a lot of goodwill in all quarters, and once again, thank you very much. And for you guys, the next issue of Horizons is going to be about an equally interesting topic. It's going to be about the Middle East. And we're going to have a number of views and a number of interesting authors and a number of interesting people debating it in the U.S. promotion, which is going to be in April or May of this year. So stay tuned, read Horizons, follow CIRSD, and thank you very much for your attendance.